Ironically, one of the first signs of really good improvement in the employment markets may be a spike in unemployment as some of these discouraged workers come back. Now, Houston should be doing better than it is. Let's think about how we got into this. We were the last in, among the very last into this recession. The recession was dated in December 2007 in terms of beginning the recession in the U.S. as a whole. We go in October, November of the following year. But we had a mild U.S. recession. We had a serious financial crisis and a deep U.S. recession. Then we have a global decline. For the first time in 40 years, we see the world economy actually shrink. That ends the commodity boom. Commodity prices collapse, and Houston is the last in. Now, if we were going to be the last out, we would have to undo that. We would have to reinflate the national economy, then the Houston economy, the national economy, then the global economy with the U.S. as the leader. The global economy would follow. And then commodities would follow, and Houston would be last out. But we're actually seeing, as I will show you, very rapid growth in the global economy. Commodity prices have popped up dramatically in metals, not just in oil, but in metals, agricultural products across the board as global growth has resumed at a fairly rapid pace. And that short circuits the path for Houston. Now it's the global economy leading, commodities leading, and Houston as a commodity-dependent economy should be one of the early ones out of the gate. And we haven't seen that, and I think there's a tremendous amount of policy uncertainty that has been generated by Congress as a byproduct of all of these programs that have been proposed. You think about the four things that Houston does: upstream oil, downstream oil, the medical center, and the space center. All of them have faced big policy uncertainty. The moratorium, cap and trade, a big deal downstream. Energy is their main input. Certainly healthcare has affected the future planning at the medical center. And of course, the Obama administration would like to simply do away with manned spaceflight. So significant issues at each one of these big growth poles in Houston that have really prevented us, I think, from moving ahead the way we could. Let's talk just a minute about the U.S. recovery and what we see in the U.S. recovery. This is a coincident index that's put together by the National Bureau of Economic Research. They actually use this to date the business cycle. It's a group of academics. And they look at industrial production, wholesale and retail trade, payroll employment, personal income, less transfer payments, and they add it together essentially as a coincident measure of activity in the business cycle. You can see they date the decline that begins, the recession begins, we hit the peak December 2007. It ends summer of 2009, in June of 2009, and you can see it has been a very slow and torturous recovery to date. We have not seen a big bounce back. Now, what should you expect? What should your expectations be in terms of a recovery? What do you expect to see? Milton Friedman, who is the great Chicago economist, said, what you should expect to see, it's like a guitar string. You pull back hard, and the economy is going to snap back and come back fast. And certainly we pulled down hard, but unfortunately, Milton Friedman had one exception. If you have a serious financial crisis, you're going to see financial institutions damaged, credit remains tight on the other side, and you see the recovery unfold very, very slowly. So what we are looking at right now is, in fact, the exception to the guitar string theory unfold. Credit, I think, for large businesses has pretty much healed itself. If you look, however, at smaller businesses, and particularly the consumer, where there's a lot of deleveraging still underway, you see the credit issues really unfolding. There are a lot of fears of a double dip. I think if other things equal, we should probably avoid the double dip. I think the fears of the double dip came really, first of all, from some very slow GDP growth numbers that we saw. They came from some sudden weakness in the housing market and from the European crisis that was unfolding at the time, if we go back over last summer. And I think I can put these in perspective for you a little bit. However, they're still pointing to quite slow growth in front of us. We can talk about the GDP numbers, which actually we've been growing for about 5 quarters, and for a couple of quarters they looked really good. We saw 3.5%, 4%, 5% rates of growth. They were exaggerated, however, and exaggerated by a really vicious inventory cycle. As we fell into the crisis, a lot of companies, let's say shoe stores, let's take a shoe store, that's the easy example. As we fell into the crisis, they said, oh my gosh, I don't know where my balance sheet is, I don't know where my customers, how they're feeling. Sell everything out here in the front of the store, but don't order anything for the back. Whatever you do, don't order. So that exaggerated the downside. We hit the bottom. It wasn't the end of the world. Customers come back, and everybody says, oh my gosh, we don't have any inventory. Reorder. So the reordering process tended to exaggerate the upside. And actually, if you take inventory out of it, what you see over the last 4 or 5 quarters is growth that is about 1%, 1%, 1%, 1%, or a little better, or a little less. One of the features of this economy that has sort of set it apart has been the difference between employment growth and GDP. Now, we could perhaps explain this by slow growth, productivity, output per worker, reworking the number of technology in our factories or in our stores allows us to get more output per worker at a rate of about 1% per year. So if growth continued at 1%, there would never be any reason to hire anybody. And in fact, over the last 4 or 5 quarters, that's what we've seen is growth at about 1%. But I think the other piece of this goes back to that slide I showed you on Houston, which is something of a national phenomenon, which is this uncertainty that has been generated many, many fronts. But maybe the best story I can give you. Early this year, I talked to this gentleman. He's the CFO of a chemical company here. And the board of governors had said, call around and ask people how people feel about capital expenditures. And he said, well, we're not spending anything, not a penny. And I said, cut off from capital markets? What's the problem? He said, no, we've got lots of money and we got lots of ideas. He said, but look, I don't know what it costs to hire an employee. I don't know cap and trade. Our main input is energy. We don't know where that's going. I don't know the tax rate and I don't know the tax structure. So how is it I'm going to compute a return on investment to take to my board of directors? We really can't move forward with anything. So like the policies that are proposed or not, an unintended consequence has been to make it very difficult to commit, to make decisive decisions. For small businesses, the healthcare issue is a significant problem because that one additional employee can entail some significant cost. Now, housing. Slow growth was sort of exposed. If we looked at GDP, we saw slow growth that was really continuing for some time, exposed as the inventory cycle ended, and that slow growth, as far as we can see, continues. The second problem was suddenly, just as soon as we saw that, we had really bad news from the housing market. Bad news. All of a sudden, all of the numbers were declining and declining dramatically. This has been a huge downturn in housing. You can see with single-family starts declining 75% over the course of this downturn, from 1.6 million to fewer than 400,000. And just as it looks like we're on our way up, all of a sudden we see the bad news. This was a result of the first-time home buyers tax credit, where we pulled so many of the sales into the spring. And I hope, maybe Mark will have more input here, I hope what we're seeing is a normal adjustment process, similar to what we saw after cash for clunkers, where it took several months to work back to a normal market.